Hello and welcome to A Bit Too Much to Think. Today is the first episode in a series that I'm starting calling out academics for lying. Now, people in academia lie, and it happens a lot. And sometimes it happens not by outright lying about data, like the guy who started the anti-vax movement, but by lying about what the real data that was collected may mean. In this case, there are two papers that lie about how voter ID law would affect people. There's largely a concern about minority and elderly voters lacking access to valid photo IDs, which I think is a fair concern considering we don't want voters to be excluded from voting for any reason. But here's the problem. The two papers I am talking about set out to prove only that voter ID laws would restrict voting, and only have an agenda set forth. They're lacking intellectual rigor, but are taken so incredibly seriously. And I think, to be honest, whether or not a person does or does not support voter ID laws is irrelevant here. Academia has a duty to the public to develop an understanding of what the truth is, and blatantly lying to the public is wrong no matter what the conclusion is, versus what the reality is. Lying is wrong. Period. End of story. The first paper I'm talking about is taken incredibly seriously. Well, both are. But this first one is cited 120 times on Google Scholar. And Google Scholar does not even cover every academic paper written. It's just a search engine. And don't tell me that all 120 papers citing it are negative. They most certainly are not. This paper is also used in news articles as proof that voter ID laws are racist. And maybe it very well is, but you have to prove that using science. That's what academia is supposed to do, and this paper completely fails. Honestly, papers like these should never have passed peer review, but because academia is so biased to the crazy far left, you end up with garbage like this everywhere, and that is why I'm calling them out. So the first paper is called The Disproportionate Impact of Voter ID Requirements on the Electorate, New Evidence from Indiana. This is published in 2009, so it's a little older. It starts by pointing out that the Supreme Court heard arguments on January 8, 2008 for Crawford v. Marion County Election Board, talking about the Indiana voter ID law, which the authors say is one of the most strict in the country. Their goal then is to prove that having to present a valid photo ID issued by the state or federal government would restrict voters, especially minority and elderly voters. And it's worth noting here that the Supreme Court ended up approving the law, and the people opposing the law in the Supreme Court failed to, quote, produce any witnesses who claimed they would be unable to meet the law's requirements, end quote. The authors say that they, quote, find strong evidence to support our thesis that strict voter identification laws would substantially affect lower-income, minority, and elderly voters. So let's get to the methods. What they did is they essentially called people and asked through a series of questions. Now, here's the problem with this paper. The questions they asked only had the question of, do you currently have a valid photo identification? And they say, when they're determining who would be negatively affected by this law, they say that the goal is, quote, to determine the rates of access to valid photo identification. But there's a footnote on the word access. Now, okay, when I say the word access to a valid ID, most would assume it means two things. Either having a valid ID, which they asked about, or being able to get one, which was never asked. But that's the general context the word access should have. But this heaping pile of lying garbage paper, the footnote defines access as only having a valid ID. It has absolutely nothing to do with the ability to get one, which is an extremely important part of this and an extremely important part of the voter ID discussion as a whole. A voter ID law may actually restrict people who oppose being photographed on religious grounds, or who don't have a formal address like many Native Americans might, or maybe they cannot drive like most elderly, or maybe they cannot afford to get one like low-income people, or maybe they live crazy far away from a DMV. That is a problem of access, and that is a problem of figuring out a way for them to get an ID. That has nothing to do with simply whether or not they currently have one. And you can look through the entire data and methods sections of this paper. There is nothing asking if they have the ability to go get an ID. There's nothing asking a person if they can afford $25 for a state ID. Nothing about whether or not they live close to a DMV. Nothing if the elderly have a child or grandchild that can take them to a licensing center. Nothing. The questions are never asked. This is why this paper is such a massive pile of crap. It only asks if people currently have a valid ID. And if they say no, then they say, oh, okay, it must affect you negatively. It never asks if the people plan to get a valid ID, or even if they are aware that they need one to vote. So it's absolute garbage. If you're going to have intellectual rigor when trying to see if having a valid ID is an issue for someone, you have to ask them if they're aware, for example, if a voter ID law were to be put into place, you have to ask them, like, are you aware that that was put into place? You have to ask them, do you plan to get a valid ID before the voting? Do you even plan to vote? You have to ask these important questions to have any intellectual rigor. And the problem is that so many crappy papers like this are getting published because they support an ideology and not because they're actually good papers. So the next paper, Voter Identification Laws and the Suppression of Minority Votes, came out much more recently, published on April 2017. Now, just on Google Scholar, it is cited 116 times. Again, Google Scholar is just a search engine, so it does not necessarily have every paper that cited this one. Considering that most papers tend to have between 20 and 50 citations on Google Scholar, this paper clearly made an impact. And again, not every paper citing this one is negative. I would bet that the vast majority are positive. Again, the reason I'm calling these papers out is because they lie. They lack any intellectual rigor in their conclusion and never should have passed peer review. But now, everyone's taking this conclusion as gospel that voter ID laws suppress minority votes. Now, this paper is a lot harder to understand and drags on, with really confusing information placement and unclear language. This may be a bit of an aside, but basically this is done all the time in academia, and many call this phenomenon academic ease. Essentially, the goal is to pack a lot of info into a small sentence, but what happens all the time is that academics fail to make clear their ideas and make the academic knowledge that should belong to all people essentially ununderstandable. It's a failure of academic ability, in truth. But anyway, I'm here to hopefully clear things up. So this paper uses something called the Cooperative Congressional Elections Study for its data, which it says, quote, since the study has large samples from every state in each election cycle, we can compare turnout by different subgroups in every state to see if strict voter ID laws alter turnout. Here's the first problem with this paper. It lists the sample size they use in footnote 16. It is a garbage sample size for Latinos, Asian Americans, and mixed-race Americans. The sample size isn't even close to the percentages of racial populations in the U.S., let alone near good enough for sample size for accurate depiction of U.S. population as a whole. Most importantly, the ratio is way off for comparing groups. You cannot compare 32,000 white people to 459 Asian people. No way in hell. The next problem I have is with Figure 1, which is presented as a representation of the changing voter turnout with voter ID states and non-voter ID states. Here's the thing. They just compare racial percentages of turnout by state, taking into account no other factors. They even admit in the paper that the change might have nothing to do with the voter ID laws. And if we're being honest and having intellectual rigor, which these papers lack, it could have something to do with maybe, again, access to an ID. Maybe there's not enough DMVs in that state. Maybe that's the problem we have to address. Maybe it's just the overall percentage of people of each race that vote. But the problem is, if we're being honest, it probably has a lot more to do with other things than it does with just one little law. So then, why include it in the paper? The answer is because it's an easy way to bias people towards your side and create an easy-to-read figure that supports their ideology, not the facts they're arguing. I think that's why I hate this paper so much, is because the rest of it is generally sound in its analysis, outside of the fact that it has terrible sample sizes for comparisons. But it is so ideologically based, and it takes away from any objective analysis of facts. And that is indicative of a major problem with academia today. There is no desire in academia today to be objective, especially in the soft sciences, your political science, your psychology, your sociology. It's all just ideologically driven. But I said this before, and I'm going to say this again. The academic world, and academics as a whole, have a duty to the public to develop the truth. That is a duty that every academic is beholden to. Now, it might be in separate fields. So, for example, an academic in chemistry might have a duty to develop an understanding of the truth as it relates to chemistry. But an academic in political science has a duty to develop the truth in politics, not blatantly lie to the public. A person's ideology should be entirely irrelevant to the conclusion that they come up with. Sometimes conclusions agree with ideology, and sometimes they very ardently disagree. You have to have some level of intellectual rigor to determine what the truth is. And the fact is that academia has been lacking that for so long. That's why I'm starting this series, and that's why I'm calling it Stupid Academia. Because it's time for the academics to get off their ass and start helping fix the world. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of A Bit Too Much to Think. I hope you like this idea for a new series, and I hope you look forward to more. More is definitely on its way. So, if you liked it, leave a like. If you want to see more, subscribe. And if you have any more thoughts on this subject, go ahead and leave a comment. Again, I'm going to say this again. Whether or not you support voter ID laws is irrelevant in this discussion. I'm talking about academics lying to the public. It's just that voter ID is one area primarily where I saw it, especially with these two papers that are considered to be golden standards for this subject. So try not to get into too much political argument, though I understand it's YouTube comments, so it is what it is. Thank you so much for listening, and have a wonderful day.